What we've seen today is something more familiar to us from the last 5 years of the Zuma presidency, where we have speakers like Mr. Tsanodi having to intervene, having to protect the person on the podium, in this case Mr. Mabuza himself, from some rather tricky questions that are seen as follow-up questions, and we're, I think, threatening to return to a debate about what is a true follow-up question and what is a new question, because that, I think, is part of what is going on here today.
Tasneem, of course, this question about the nationalization of the Reserve Bank came up. It was a question he completely, he decided he was completely unwilling to respond in this particular forum to.
Well, it wasn't the only question that he decided he was unwilling to respond to, but I mean, it looks like the ANC is unsure of what its position on this actually is. They had a resolution from the conference. It was supposed to be discussed at Parliament. It was then taken off the table, withdrawn as a motion in Parliament. So it seems to me like there's a bit of uncertainty about what the ANC wants to do here. And it kind of links to the question at the end, which was around radical economic transformation, one of the written questions that was asked. And really the question there is, for me, is what are the points around radical economic transformation beyond the land question, because that's been discussed quite a lot by the ANC, that they are willing to talk about and to discuss, and perhaps this fits into that, although many have said that it won't, nationalizing the Reserve Bank won't have a massive impact on the economy necessarily, but it is part of a broader package of issues that perhaps they are being avoided in discussions around economic transformation.
Angelo, speak for a moment about this interesting interaction over the Dalai Lama and whether or not he was going to be allowed to come to South Africa.
So that for me was again an internal tension between an old ANC that is still there in some form and a new ANC that must emerge. And for me this is the difference between being a liberation movement and being a party of government. So for the last 24 years, South Africa's foreign policy has been consistently not to interfere in the internal and domestic arrangements of other countries. And this, of course, has a direct contradiction to the liberation movement policy about the requirement of the international community to intervene in what the National Party said: apartheid is an internal domestic arrangement, don't interfere in our business. And then the second issue there is, if South Africa is this human rights-based society, what about the human rights basis of the agitation for independence of the people of Tibet and the people of Taiwan under this one China policy that the ANC government supports? And so those kinds of nuances, I think, were there in the questions, and I don't think Mr. Mabuza was quite as, shall we say, nuanced as he could have been in finagling a response that would have responded more adequately, because he simply threw the question back at the DA MP who asked it and saying, if you ask me these questions, I can ask you what it is that it makes you so interested in this. And this, of course, comes after two MPs had reminded him that the process in Parliament is that MPs ask the questions and members of the executive give the answers. It's as if we haven't gone through that constitutional reminder of the role of Parliament in holding the executive to account and how that is a constitutional requirement. This isn't politicking, shall we say, in the space where we are heading up to an election. This is the Deputy President standing up in the legislature to respond to the people's representatives and their questions on behalf of the people. He is forced to answer them, and not answering them or indicating that he will answer them somewhere else. The question arises, where is this somewhere else? Because it is the National Assembly where accountability between the legislature and the executive is supposed to happen.
Let's look for a moment at this issue of the question of Mduduzi Manana, whom we know was involved in an incident of assault. A question was asked as to why he remains a member of Parliament after this incident. Let's take a look at that exchange.
I think Manana has been convicted, he went to court, and we believe that people can be corrected. We don't have a dustbin where we throw people. We correct people, we move with them. That's what we believe.
Was that an adequate response in your view, Tasneem?
Absolutely not. I think it was one of probably his worst responses on the day. For one, though, I think it exposes, the contradictions in the ANC on this question, right? That they can speak a kind of progressive, speak around gender, which is what he was doing all along until that question came along. But at the same time, they have, these massive issues in the party. And I think given the context, in terms of questions of gender that have come up in the last few months in the ANC, it's an inadequate answer. But at the same time, though, we have to spare thought for him, right? He's having to defend the entire party here for putting someone like Manana in that position in Parliament as an MP. And I think perhaps it's a little bit, we should be a little bit fair to him there. So I think the critique here is really around the ANC and the ANC's position on this, and that should be the question. How he answered it, then we can also talk about, which is why I said that I think he answered it poorly, and it exposes those kind of problems that come from government and the ANC on this question. But we should also be fair that this is a problem that he's been asked to answer for, that really we need to ask really serious questions about.
Angelo, this would have been the South African citizens' first real interaction with him if they had not known him up to this point. What would you say their impression would be of whether we do have a deputy president who has a hold on the major issues plaguing the country right now?
I think as a first performance, I'm slightly less generous than Lester Kivett was. I don't think that, I think he could have done better, let me put it that way. I think he could have been better prepared by both his party as well as by the ministers that serve in cabinet with him so that he could answer these questions better. They should have anticipated some of the follow-up questions, and I think I'm also slightly more, should we say, slightly less generous than Tasneem is on the question of his response to the violence against women question. We live in a femicidal country. If the Deputy President of the Republic of South Africa cannot adequately answer this question of why a person who is convicted of the assault of two women still sits in Parliament as a member of his party, that speaks to a real failure to understand just how serious this issue is. I think that anybody who stands up for a party that says it is in the interest of women's rights and women's equality and wants to get rid of femicidal violence against women must have an adequate response to this question, because they must have anticipated it. It is called politics. And so for me it is a really sad moment in 2018 to sit after 24 years of democratic agitation around women's rights that a figure as high up on the hierarchy of political power as the Deputy President can't answer that question adequately. The question, other questions that were put to him again on policy issues around tax avoidance versus tax evasion, which he didn't respond to adequately. He's supposed to be the head of government business. There is a real concern here, about how somebody who has been in the job for a month hasn't been adequately prepared, it seems, to answer on the details of policy questions. And also coming in the wake of Cyril Ramaphosa, who has signalled, I think, a different kind of engagement. I think it's not just about knowing the material, it's also about knowing how the party and the government intends to engage issues of accountability differently and more productively. And there I think Mr. Mabuza has perhaps a little longer to go along this road in order to catch up with what his employer, the President of the Republic of South Africa, has signalled to the rest of us as a new dawn, as an era for hope.